That very first night, I thought I was dreaming, or at least I wanted to believe I was. The house had this kind of oppressive quiet, the kind that digs under your skin and fills your ears with your own heartbeat. It was the silences that makes you wonder if you're awake, or if something else is, waiting. A muffled thump jolted me from my thoughts. It was heavy, purposeful, like someone dropped a bag of wet sand once, just to let me know they were there. I stayed flat on my back, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it was nothing. A branch against the siding, the house settling. But then it came again, louder, closer. The bed was empty beside me. Tina's pillow looked untouched, her side of the covers folded neatly, like she'd never been there at all. I sat up slowly, peeling the blanket off my chest. The air felt off, like it had weight, like it was thicker near the floor. It tasted metallic, sharp enough to make me think of a loose filling. My feet hit the ground, the cold crawling up through my legs. There was no light on in the hall, but the dark felt safer somehow, less exposed. The stairs were just a few steps away, but they loomed on forever in the dimness. From the top, I could hear it again. Thump, drag, thump. Something heavy, shifting its weight across the floor below. Between each sound, there was this faint scrape of wood, a quiet screech, like nails disturbingly long for their own hands, curling and scratching. I gripped the railing, the edge of the wood biting into my palm, and leaned just enough to see the door at the bottom of the stairs. It wasn't wide open, but it wasn't closed either. A pale glow seeped out from the crack, a light tinged too orange to belong to anything in this house. The smell hit me halfway down, and it was worse than anything I'd imagined. It was sweet and sour at once, like meat left in the sun to rot, but still dripping, oozing something darker and thicker than blood. It clung to me, filling my throat, forcing me to breathe through my mouth. The dragging stopped, and then came the tearing. Wet, deliberate, rhythmic. It sounded like someone was pulling something apart, shredding it with their hands. Flesh from bone, muscle giving way. The sound was so visceral, so intimate, that it felt like an intrusion just hearing it. My legs locked halfway down, my body frozen in a stupid, futile instinct to disappear into the shadows. The door shifted, the creak high and faint, the kind that lingers in your ears long after it ends. Just an inch, maybe less, but enough to let me see what was behind it. The light inside flickered, revealing a shadow that didn't belong. It was hunched, massive to say the least. Its hands moved slowly, methodically, something slick between its fingers. The floor glistened beneath it, dark smears crawling outward in jagged veins, pooling into uneven shapes. I staggered back. My heel caught the edge of the stair, and the creak that followed wasn't subtle. It wasn't quiet. It split the silence like a scream. The shadow froze. I could feel its attention without having turned. My whole body felt like it was shaking apart, my legs ready to give out. But I moved. I turned, climbing the stairs in what barely passed for a run, the wood groaning under my weight. My hands fumbled for the bedroom door, pushing it shut behind me as I collapsed onto the bed. My chest heaved, the smell still thick in my throat. The sounds didn't follow. The dragging, the tearing, the whispers of movement. Gone. Tina slipped into bed hours later, the mattress dipping under her weight. She curled up beside me, her breathing steady, her hair damp against my neck. She smelled of bleach. The smell came back the next evening, worse than before. It wasn't something you could ignore. It was the kind of stench that burrows into your nose, latches onto your brain, and refuses to let go. Bitter, heavy. It slithered through the house like it had a purpose, curling into the corners and coiling around every breath I took. I stood there in the doorway, watching Tina at the counter. She hummed as she worked, her back to me, her movements quick and precise. The knife in her hand rose and fell with a steady rhythm, the sound of it striking the cutting board oddly soothing if you didn't think about it too much. But I was thinking about it. Her hair clung to the back of her neck, damp with sweat, or maybe something else. Her shoulders moved with purpose. She didn't stop, not once, like she was locked into some kind of trance. The trash can caught my eye. Its lid was tilted to the side, and the smell grew denser as I moved closer. I don't know why I looked inside. Some things you can't unsee, you know? But I did it anyway, leaning down, my stomach nodding before I dared to look at it. At first it just looked like trash. Food scraps maybe. But then the light hit something pale and wet. I froze. Meat. Not the grocery store kind. This wasn't neat or clean. It was rough, jagged, cut by hands that didn't care about appearances. Strings of yellow fat dangled from the edges, clinging to patches of grayish skin. One piece had a tuft of hair stuck to it, thin and dark. At the bottom of the bag, something small caught the light. Round, white. A tooth? My breath caught, my chest locking up as I jerked back. The knife in the kitchen stopped mid-chop, the sound hanging in the air like a question. Tina turned her head, just a little. Her hair shifted against her shoulder, but she didn't look at me, didn't say a word. Then the knife started again, slower this time, deliberate. I backed away, stumbling into the living room, my hands gripping the edge of the sofa like it was the only thing keeping me upright. The fabric was rough under my palms, grounding me. The metallic taste in my mouth was worse, thick and cloying, sticking to the back of my throat. From the kitchen, the chopping didn't stop. It was steady, unbothered, like nothing had happened. The noises came back that night, thumps, louder and faster. Something heavy being dropped and dragged, again and again and again. They started in the basement and worked their way through the house, while each sound hit me like a punch to the chest. I didn't move. I stayed in bed, the sheets bunched up in my fists, my body locked in place. The smell was back too, stronger than ever, clinging to the air like a stain. Then came the wet slap. It hit the floor outside the bedroom, slow and deliberate, like someone throwing raw meat onto tile. My stomach churned, my throat tightening as I pressed myself against the headboard. The hallway light flickered, casting shadows beneath the door. One of them moved. It wasn't fast, wasn't frantic. It just shifted, like something pacing back and forth, waiting for the right moment. The wet sound stopped. The shadow froze. The door didn't open. I squeezed my eyes shut, my chest burning as I tried to block it all out. The smell, the sounds, the waiting. Morning came eventually, though it didn't feel like a relief. It was pale, washed out, the kind of light that barely makes it through the windows. Tina was already up. Her side of the bed was untouched, as if she hadn't slept at all. The kitchen reeked of lemon cleaner, stinging and overpowering, cutting through the lingering stench from the night before. Tina stood by the counter, her hands resting on the edge. The tips of her fingers were pink, like she'd been scrubbing something raw. The knife lay in the sink, its blade gleaming, streaks of water running down the handle. She turned to me, her smile wide and unbothered. Her teeth were white, perfectly straight. I didn't ask. The basement door was open when I got home. It wasn't just ajar. It yawned, wide and waiting, like it had been expecting me. The hallway stood in eerie silence, the kind that pricks at your ears and makes you strain for a non-existent sound. The hum of the refrigerator buzzed in the distance, a monotone drone that felt almost alive. From the darkness of the stairwell, the smell crawled up. It wasn't subtle. It was thick, syrupy, clinging to my throat with an almost sweet edge that turned sour when I breathed too deeply. My chest tightened, my ribs pressing inward like they wanted to cage my lungs. I shouldn't have stepped closer. The first stair gave under my weight with a long, brittle creak, a sound that got swallowed by the dark before it could echo. The air thickened as I descended, each breath sticking like molasses in my chest. The walls seemed to lean inward, pressing closer with every step, the scrape of my shoes against the wood. The light at the bottom didn't do much. It flickered, sputtering with a yellow haze that seemed more like a failing heartbeat than illumination. The floor below was concrete, uneven and stained, the kind of stains that never come clean. Something spread across the center of the room, a sprawl of reds and blacks, wet and gleaming under the flickering bulb. At first, it looked like a stock-still shadow. Then I stepped closer, and the shadow became meat. It wasn't a neat butcher's work. This was violence, raw and unapologetic. Chunks of flesh were scattered like a puzzle missing all its edges, slick with fresh blood. Some pieces still had taut, bruised and torn skin, matted with dark hairs and dirt. A hand rested among the wreckage, its fingers curled inward like it had tried to protect itself even after the blade came down. The wrist was severed crudely, the bone jagged and exposed, white against the slick crimson. I swallowed hard, my stomach pitching as I forced my legs to carry me deeper into the room. In the corner, the metal table glinted under the weak light. Its surface was smeared with crimson streaks that trailed off the edge, dripping to the floor in uneven rivulets. Tools were scattered across it. Hooks, cleavers, a saw whose teeth were crusted with shreds of something fibrous and dark. The drain beneath the table let out a faint gurgle, and the floor around it shimmered, damp with reddish streaks that crawled toward the edges of the room. Something hung from the ceiling. At first, I thought it was just a tarp. The light was dim, and my brain clung to the idea of it being something ordinary, something safe. But as I stepped closer, the shape sharpened. The ribcage jutted out, stark and skeletal, the flesh stripped clean in some places and hanging in others, tatters swaying like wet fabric. There was no head. The neck was a jagged stump, oozing a thick black-red sludge that dripped onto the floor. The sound of the dripping drew my eyes to the far corner. A bucket sat there, almost brimming, its contents dark and viscous. Each drop from the carcass splashed into the bucket with a sickening plop, sending ripples through the surface. The light flickered. A shape moved behind the hanging ribs, slow and deliberate. Fingers emerged first, pale and stained, trailing along the exposed bone like an artist admiring their work. The shape shifted, the light steadied, and Tina stepped into view. Her back was to me, her hair tied into a loose braid that hung low, brushing her bloodied gloves. She was hunched over the table, her movements precise, methodical. She didn't look up, didn't falter, her hands sinking into the carcass with a familiarity that turned my stomach. She tilted her head, just enough for the flickering light to cast over her face. Blood streaked her cheek, drying in uneven trails. Her lips parted, her tongue darting out to catch a smear of red that glistened along the edge of her mouth. Her eyes stayed fixed on the slab of flesh in her hands, unblinking, unhurried. I couldn't move. My breath caught, stuck somewhere between my chest and my throat, trapped by the weight of the air. The creak of my heel against the floor broke the silence. Her hands paused just before resuming their task. She didn't turn. I backed away, my legs heavy, my pulse slamming against my ribs. The light flickered again as I reached the stairs, each creak of the wood a betrayal. When I reached the top, the door was closed. The smell was worse in the morning. It didn't just linger, it invaded. It filled every corner, soaked into the walls, pressed into the back of my throat until it tasted like rusted pennies. It made me gag if I thought about it too long. Tina didn't seem to notice. She hummed as she cleaned the countertops, her gloved hands moving with precision. The trash bags by the back door were tied tight, bulging with misshapen lumps that strained against the plastic. Dark stains bled through the bottoms, pooling on the tiles. I didn't ask her about the basement. I couldn't. The noises started earlier that night. I lay in bed, waiting for the inevitable. But it wasn't the dragging or faint creaks that came this time. It started with something sharper and wet. A crunch, low and deliberate, followed by the grind of teeth through tendon. My breath hitched, my fingers curling into the sheets, twisting them into ropes. Tina's side of the bed was empty, untouched, her pillow smoothed flat. The smell was back, thick and metallic, wrapping itself around me like a second skin. The crunching grew louder. Each snap sent a ripple of nausea through my chest, followed by a sound I couldn't ignore. A slow, wet slurp, like marrow being sucked from a bone. My legs didn't want to move. Every part of me screamed to stay where I was, to close my eyes, to let the darkness smother it all. But I couldn't. I swung my feet to the floor, the cold biting into my skin, and crept toward the door. The hallway was endless. Shadows pooled at the corners where the light from the bedroom didn't quite reach. The sound grew louder, clearer with every step. It wasn't just eating, it was tearing. At the end of the hall, the basement door stood ajar. The air thickened as I approached, heavier with each breath. It carried the tang of blood, like a butcher's shop left to rot. My stomach turned, but the sound pulled me forward, overriding the instinct to run. My fingers brushed the edge of the door, and it gave way with a groan. The basement was alive with shadows, the light above flickering weakly, casting jagged shapes that crawled along the walls. Tina was on the floor. Her legs were tucked beneath her, her body hunched over something that sprawled beside her. A slab of flesh rested on her lap, slick and raw. She worked with a focus that chilled me, her hands peeling skin from muscle in long, precise strips. Her nails were blackened, clotted with dried blood. The remains of something, or someone, were splayed beside her. The ribcage was split wide, jagged edges jutting like splintered wood. The organs were laid out in a neat row, each glistening under the weak light. The head was turned to the side, the neck twisted unnaturally. The face was slack, but the lips were pulled into a faint smile, frozen in something that was far from peace. I couldn't move. My chest tightened as I watched her lift a piece of flesh to her mouth. Her jaw dropped wide open, teeth sinking into the meat with a wet, visceral snap. Blood streaked her chin, dripping in thick rivulets down her neck, pooling in the hollow of her collarbone. She chewed slowly, deliberately, her head tilting as if savoring every bite. Her hands moved again, the knife slicing through muscle and tendon with practiced ease. The blade scraped against bone, the sound sending a shiver that rooted me to the spot. She paused, her head turned, her eyes glinting under the dim light. Blood smeared her cheek, catching in the curve of her smile. Her lips parted, her teeth shining dark and wet. For a moment, I thought she'd seen me, her gaze piercing. When she turned back to the carcass, her hands resumed their work. A low, quiet laugh bubbled from her throat, soft and thick, sticking to my skin like tar. I backed away, one step at a time, my legs shaking with every movement. The door creaked as I closed it, the sound swallowed by the noises behind it, the tearing, the slurping, the rhythmic scrape of her knife. When I climbed back into bed, the sheets were cold. Her side was still empty. The smell of iron lingered, faint but unyielding. It was almost impossible to fall asleep. That night, I dreamt of a disembodied entity demanding I confess my sins. It told me this would all go away if I'd just tell someone. It assured me this was all in my head. When I woke up, I searched for Tina, convinced I could run to her arms for comfort. She would understand. Her trauma was worse than mine, after all. I contemplated finally getting my darkest secret off my chest and had been thinking of it for so long. But I couldn't. I wasn't ready for that emotional overwhelm. I shook off the thought and pondered. The smell had taken on a life of its own. It wasn't just in the house anymore. It was in me, crawling into my lungs and settling in the pit of my stomach. Heavy, rancid, and sour, it coated everything, like ash smothering a fire. I kept the windows open, stuffed towels under doors, but it didn't matter. It wasn't leaving. Tina was the only thing untouched by it. She hummed her little tunes in the kitchen, moving with a strange lightness. Her gloves never came off anymore, yellowed at the edges, smeared with stains she pretended weren't there. By the back door, trash bags sat swollen and misshapen, their black plastic stretching under the weight of something awful. I didn't ask. She'd look at me sometimes, her lips curling in that careful way. Her eyes lingered and searched for something she couldn't find. "You've been so quiet," she said once, her voice smooth, almost tender. "Are you sure you're okay?" Her words stuck like barbs, small and thorny. They didn't hurt at first, but they didn't leave either. They dug deeper the longer I ignored them. That night, the house came alive again. The thumps were heavier than before, rattling the floorboards like they were trying to shake the house apart. A slow, deliberate scrape followed, nails dragging against wood. I buried my face in the pillow to drown it out, but it seeped in anyway, slipping past my ears and settling in my chest. Whispers followed. They started soft, just a faint murmur that could have been wind slipping through the cracks. The voice grew louder, threading itself through the dark. It was me, but not me. It hissed secrets I hadn't thought about in years. A fight with my father, a lie I told my oldest friend, things I'd shoved so far down I forgot they were even there. I couldn't stay still anymore. The bed creaked as I sat up, my legs swinging over the edge. The air pressed against my skin, thick and wet, and the hallway dragged on before me, dim and endless. At the far end, the basement door hung open again, the edges splintered and raw. The light from below flickered, throwing jagged shadows onto the walls. "Confess," the voice whispered, twisting into my skull like a drill. The stairs were slick as I descended, each step gleaming under the faint yellow glow. My foot slipped once, the wood catching just enough to stop me from falling. The smell thickened with every step, choking the air until it felt like I was breathing rot. Tina was in the center of the room, her back to me, framed by the weak, flickering light. The table in front of her gleamed, its metal surface smeared with thick, shiny streaks of crimson. She was humming again. Her voice was soft, unhurried, as her hands worked. The thing on the table wasn't whole anymore. Its chest was open, ribs splayed wide like shattered teeth. Coils of intestines lay beside it, shimmering, their ends frayed and leaking. A neat pile of organs rested nearby, each one glistening and raw. Tina tilted her head, her gloved hands cradling something small and pale. A heart. She raised it to her lips, her jaw parting slowly. Her teeth sank into it with a wet crunch, the sound slicing through the room. Blood ran down her chin, thick and dark, pooling at the base of her throat. She chewed deliberately, savoring, her head tilting as though she were listening to something only she could hear. I don't remember stepping back, but the wall caught my shoulder with a dull thud. The sound must have been louder than I thought, because her head snapped toward me, sudden and unnatural. Her smile curled back to her ears, and her dark, jagged teeth gleamed, her lips smeared with red. Blood streaked her cheeks, dripping in thin lines down to her collarbone. She didn't move, didn't speak. Her eyes locked on mine, unblinking, heavy. Something in her hum shifted, deeper, darker, curling at the edges like it was melting. I turned and bolted, my hands fumbling for the railing as I stumbled up the stairs. The walls seemed to close in, the smell pressing against me, filling my throat. The whispers followed. They weren't words anymore, just a tangled mess of sounds, sharp and wet and endless. I reached the bedroom door, slamming it shut behind me, my back pressed against the wood. My legs shook. The whispers faded, replaced by something worse. Tina's hum drifted up from below, soft and steady, calm as ever. I didn't sleep that night. Again. The table shouldn't have been set. Not like that. Not at all. Tina's side of the bed was cold, her pillow untouched, her absence so complete it was like she'd never been there. The air was worse than before, coppery, so thick it crawled down my throat and refused to leave. A soft clink of cutlery, precise and deliberate, sheared through the silence like the toll of a distant bell. I forced myself upright, legs heavy and unsteady, like I'd forgotten how to move. At the end of the hallway, the dining room glowed with an unnatural flicker, the candles casting shapes that snaked that wall. Tina was standing at the head of the table. Her hands were folded neatly, her posture serene, her face a mask so still it felt carved. The table was pristine, gleaming plates, polished silverware, a twisted, grotesque imitation of elegance. And in the center, resting on a wooden slab, was the carcass. Flayed skin hung in uneven strips. Its ribs were pried open, splayed outward. They reminded me of wings, not of this world. To make matters worse, the cavity had been stuffed with sprigs of herbs and roasted vegetables, their steam rising in the flickering candlelight. The head was still attached, tilted toward me. The jaw hung slack, the lips curved into a faint smile, frozen and mocking. Blood pooled beneath the table in a pattern similar to spilled ink. It dripped and dripped, each drop hitting the floor with a wet plop, like a clock counting down to something I didn't want to see. Tina didn't speak. She gestured to the chair at the far end of the table, her eyes fixed on mine, heavy and unreadable. My legs moved without permission, dragging me forward. I felt like a puppet, strings jerking me toward the inevitable. The chair groaned as I sat, the wood rough against my palms. The plate she placed in front of me was immaculate. White porcelain, gleaming, untouched. The meat on it shimmered under the candlelight, thin slices, perfectly arranged, their edges marbled with streaks of fat that glistened as if they were breathing. The knife beside the plate was pristine, its blade sharp. The whispers came back. They started softly, curling around my ears like smoke, winding through the cracks in my thoughts. Then they grew louder, insistent, dragging memories to the surface that I hadn't touched in years. A fight with my father, a lie that ended a friendship, the smallest betrayals and the largest sins, each one twisting into me, cutting deeper with every word. Tina leaned forward, her shadow stretching across the table, blotting out the light. Her lips parted, revealing teeth darkened by something wet and stringy. The voice in my head matched hers perfectly. Confess. The word dragged itself across my skull, leaving something raw in its wake. My chest tightened, my breath hitching as my hands gripped the table. The whispers grew louder, voices blending into a single screaming cacophony. The knife was there, cold and waiting, its edge beaming under the faint, uneven light. I picked it up. The whispers stopped. The silence hit like a hammer, sudden and suffocating. Tina stepped back, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her lips curling into a smile that didn't belong. The glint in her eyes caught the candlelight and watched me with something that was far from human. The meat on the plate shifted. It shimmered, the faint lines of its muscle fibers twisting in ways they shouldn't. The smell hit me again. Meat. Decay. Her head tilted, her grin widening, maternal and mocking. The whispers returned, louder this time, louder than anything else. Confess. I dropped the knife. The clatter cut through the noise, but it didn't matter. The suffocating air crushed me. I pushed the chair back, the legs scraping the floor, the sound jagged and grating. My legs wobbled as I stumbled toward the door. Tina didn't move. The last thing I saw before I turned away was her hand reaching for the plate, her fingers curling around the edge of the meat. Her mouth opened, stretching wider than it should, her teeth shining with that vicious glint in her eye. The door slammed behind me, sealing the sound of her feast inside. But the wet crunch followed me anyway. I didn't look back. The hallway was longer than normal, I was sure of it. It was as if it didn't quite belong to this house, or to reality. The shadows weren't just dark. They writhed, twisting in sluggish serpentine waves that didn't follow the light. Every breath dragged through my chest like sandpaper, burning, shallow, forced. Each step felt like it was dragging me deeper into something I couldn't climb back out of. I stopped at the bathroom. Fluttering recall of the day of the fight with my father shot through my head. The trunk of my car stuffed with trash bags crudely wrapped in tape. I blinked rapidly, panting and pounding at my head to get rid of the vision. The air was colder there, the kind of cold that creeps into your bones and stays. The mirror over the sink was shattered, the cracks sprawling out from the center like a broken web. My reflection stared back, pale and hollow, my lips parted, caught in the middle of some soundless scream. Behind me, something dripped. It wasn't water. It was crawling, each drop hitting the floor with a wet, nauseating weight. I turned, but every instinct screamed not to. My legs were heavy and felt unfamiliar, like they were someone else's. The walls were smeared with something dark. The stains ran in frantic arcs, slashing across the wallpaper in chaotic patterns. A trail led from the dining room and pooled at the edges of the baseboards and soaked into the carpet like rot. The whispers came again, slithering through the air like a second skin. Low, guttural, and disturbingly close. My name twisted out of them, and it was venomous, cutting through my thoughts like a serrated blade. I pressed my hands against the walls to steady myself, trying to move back toward the hallway. Each step pulled at my legs, the carpet squelching underfoot. That's when my foot struck something soft. I froze. My gaze dropped to the floor. A finger. It lay bent, and the nail cracked and jagged, while the skin was torn and blackened at the edges. White and jagged, the tip of the bone jutted out, flecked with something dark and sticky. I staggered back, my shoulder hitting the wall hard enough to send pain shooting down my arm. The dining room door stood ajar. The glow of the candles inside pulsed, flickering in uneven bursts like they were alive, their light matching the cadence of the whispers. Her shadow stretched across the floor. Tina crouched low over the carcass, and her movements were sharp, her arms plunging into its chest cavity like she was searching for something. She pulled them out again, slick and dripping, the flesh beneath her hands sloshing around. Muscle and sinew tore apart as though they were nothing, the sound visceral against my senses. Her head jerked upward, snapping toward me with a sharp crack that echoed through the silence. Her eyes locked onto mine, full of something incomprehensible. She rose in one smooth motion, her limbs unfolding seamlessly. Her arms were longer than usual, her fingers clawed and slick with dripping gore, pooling around her feet. She stepped toward me. Her feet made no sound along the floor, but her shadow moved ahead of her, stretching outward and devouring the light. It reached me first, cold and suffocating, pressing against my chest as though it had weight. Whispers roared, rising to a deafening crescendo, which shot into screams. My own. Every word twisted with accusations, pulling memories from places I didn't even know existed, dragging guilt and shame out of me in endless waves. My father, quartered and twitching, phased in and out right in front of me. My knees buckled, and I collapsed, itching to claw my eyes out. My body might as well have been dead weight. Tina knelt before me, her blood-slick hands cupping my face. Her palms were cold, the wetness dragging across my skin in slow, deliberate motions. Her eyes burned into mine, unblinking, infinite, endless. Her smile never wavered. It stayed frozen in place, a grotesque mask of triumph and something darker, of something far worse. Then her mouth gaped. The darkness inside was infinite. Teeth glinted in the flickering light, jagged and uneven, coated in shredded tissue that clung to their edges. The last thing I saw before everything went black was her grin stretching wider, swallowing the room, the light, the air, and then nothing.